Everyone in the ballroom saw it. The Duke of Ashford, tall, titled, and beautiful in the way that only truly dangerous men are beautiful, looked at the girl in the ivory gloves and smiled. Not warmly, not with welcome, with amusement. The kind of amusement that has an edge to it, the kind you feel on your skin. She didn't look away, she didn't flush. She simply looked back at him, steady and unhurried, the way a person looks at something they already understand. And then she turned away first, as if he were a painting she had already seen and found unremarkable. Nobody did that to the Duke of Ashford. Nobody. And yet here is what no one in that ballroom knew. Not the Duchess dripping in diamonds near the fireplace. Not the young lords angling for his favor. Not even the girl herself, not fully, not yet. Those gloves she was wearing, they were finer than anything in that room. And the Duke's sneer, that small, cutting, perfectly aimed sneer, had just cost him everything he thought the world still owed him. The Whitmore ball was, by any measure, the event of the season. Lady Whitmore herself had made certain of that. The candles alone had cost a small fortune, tall ivory pillars lining every corridor, every staircase, casting the kind of light that made even ordinary faces look like paintings. The flowers were hothouse roses, deep red and almost offensively lush, and the musicians had been brought from London at considerable expense and were now stationed in the gallery above, filling the air with something that managed to be both elegant and quietly insistent. It was the sort of evening designed to make people feel that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Elinor Voss did not feel that way. She felt, if she was honest, and Elinor was almost always honest, if only with herself, faintly out of place. Not because she lacked the clothes for it, or the manners, or the composure. She had all three in abundance. But Elinor had come tonight not as a guest of honor, not as a young woman being presented or pursued or admired. She had come because her Aunt Dorothea's knees had been aching for a week, and Aunt Dorothea had refused, absolutely refused, to miss the Whitmore ball on account of something as indignified as knees. So Elinor had come as a companion, a quiet presence at her aunt's elbow, steady and undemanding, easy to overlook. She didn't mind being overlooked. She had learned over the years that being overlooked had its advantages. She collected a glass of lemonade she didn't particularly want and stood near the edge of the room while her aunt was absorbed into a cluster of women her own age, all of them talking at once with the comfortable intensity of people who have decades of shared history, and absolutely no intention of letting anyone else into the conversation. Elinor watched the room. It was what she did at events like this. She watched and she catalogued and she thought. It kept her occupied and it kept her calm, and it meant she was almost never surprised by anything, which was a quality she valued more than most people knew. She noticed the Duke of Ashford almost immediately. It would have been difficult not to. He was the sort of man rooms organized themselves around, not because he demanded it exactly, but because something in the way he held himself simply assumed it. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the kind of angular, carved-looking face that portrait painters loved and mothers warned their daughters about. He was laughing at something a man beside him had said, and even his laugh had that quality, effortless, slightly exclusive, as if the joke were better than it actually was simply because he found it amusing. Elinor looked at him for exactly as long as it took her to form an opinion. Then she looked away. She had seen his signature before. Not here, not tonight, but in her father's study, on a letter that had arrived 3 months ago, written in a hand that tried very hard to be authoritative and succeeded only in being desperate. A request for an extension, very politely worded, very carefully stripped of anything that might sound like pleading, though the pleading was there underneath, if you knew how to read between the lines. Elinor knew how to read between the lines. She had been reading her father's correspondence since she was 16. So she knew, standing there at the edge of the Whitmore ballroom with her unwanted lemonade, that the Duke of Ashford, laughing, polished, the undisputed center of the room's quiet gravity, was in a great deal of financial trouble. She doubted he knew that she knew. She had no particular intention of telling him. She was simply noting it, filing it away. The way she filed everything away. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that it happened. Elinor had drifted, as she sometimes did, toward the edge of the dancing. Not to participate, she hadn't been asked, and she wouldn't have accepted in any case, not tonight. But because she liked to watch the patterns of it, the way the formations shifted and reformed, the way people revealed themselves in how they moved and who they chose, and how they looked at their partners when they thought no one was watching. She was standing near a pillar, half in shadow when the Duke turned. She wasn't certain what had drawn his attention. Perhaps movement, perhaps nothing in particular. But he turned and his gaze landed on her, and for a moment it was simply neutral. Two people noticing each other across a room, and then his eyes dropped. To her hands, to her gloves. She saw it happen. The slight shift in his expression. The small, incredulous lift at the corner of his mouth. The look a person gets when they have spotted something they find incongruous, something that doesn't fit, and have decided that the most appropriate response is amusement. He leaned slightly toward the man beside him, Lord Fenwick, she would learn later, one of his oldest friends, and said something. Low, clearly not meant to carry. But the room had shifted just then, the music pausing between pieces, and quiet has a way of doing unexpected things to sound. She heard it. Curious, the gloves know their station better than the woman wearing them. Fenwick laughed. A woman nearby covered her smile with her fan. Elinor did not flush. She did not look down. She did not reach for composure because composure was not something she had to reach for. It was simply where she lived. She looked at the Duke of Ashford directly, steadily, for the space of 3 full seconds. Then she looked away. Not quickly, not in retreat. The way you look away from something that has told you everything you needed to know and requires no further examination. She took a small, unhurried sip of her lemonade, and she thought, so that is the kind of man you are. Across the room, the Duke of Ashford felt, for reasons he could not immediately explain, and would not have admitted to anyone, faintly, inexplicably unsettled. He looked away first. He rejoined the conversation. He laughed at something else Fenwick said. But the image stayed with him, that steady, unhurried look, the complete and utter absence of injury in it. He had aimed to sting, and he had missed, and she hadn't even needed to tell him so. The music started again. Elinor set down her lemonade on a passing tray, smoothed the front of her dress, and went to find her aunt. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Elinor knew it was important before she even touched it, not because of anything written on the outside, but because of the way her father was sitting when she walked into the study that morning. Thomas Voss was not a man who sat still. He was a pacer, a stander, a man who thought better on his feet and made decisions the way other men breathed, quickly, naturally, without visible effort. 23 years of building something from nothing had made stillness feel to him like a warning sign. He was very still. He was looking at the letter the way a man looks at something he has already read 3 times and is now simply living with. Elinor closed the door behind her. "How bad is it?" she asked. Her father looked up, and then, because he had never once in her life managed to hide anything from her for longer than 30 seconds, he almost smiled. "Sit down, Ellie," she sat. He told her about the Duke. Not everything, not yet. He told her the shape of it first, the outline, the way a careful man explains a difficult thing. The Ashford estate was in serious trouble, had been for years, quietly, invisibly, the way old money tends to collapse, not in a sudden dramatic crash, but in a long, slow, dignified deterioration that everyone pretends not to notice until it is almost too late. The late Duke, Ashford's father, had made a series of investments that had seemed sound and had not been. There were debts, old debts, compounding debts, Debts that had been managed and rearranged and managed again, until the managing itself had become the problem. The Ashford family had approached Thomas Voss 6 months ago. Not directly, through an intermediary as these things were done. Carefully, quietly, with a great deal of delicate language designed to make it sound like something other than what it was. What it was, stripped of all the delicate language, was this. They needed money, a great deal of it, and they needed it to come attached to something that made it look like a different kind of transaction entirely. They needed it to look like a marriage. Elinor listened to all of this without interrupting. It was a habit her father had built in her young, let the whole picture form before you react to any part of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she let him talk, and she watched his face more than she listened to his words, because his face always told her the part he was leaving out. When he finished, there was a silence. "You've already agreed," she said. Not an accusation, a statement. Her father didn't deny it. "I've agreed to consider it." "That's not what your face says." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at her the way he only looked at her when he was about to say something he meant completely. "I want you to have a life that is safe," he said. "I want you to have a position that no one can take from you. I have made you a great deal of money, Elinor, and money is a fine thing. I will never apologize for it, but money without standing is still a locked door in certain rooms, and I know which rooms those are because I have been standing outside them my entire life." He paused. "I don't want that for you." Elinor looked at her father, this broad, plain-spoken, deeply clever man who had started with nothing and built something extraordinary and still, felt the locked doors. And she felt, for a moment, the complicated tenderness she always felt for him. The love and the frustration and the deep, aching understanding that he was doing what he believed was right, and that it was going to be a problem. "What's his name?" she said. Her father told her. She already knew, but she let him say it, and she let her expression stay perfectly, carefully neutral. "I see," she said. She learned the rest of it not from her father, but from Cecily Ashford. It happened at the Pembroke Garden party, 11 days later, on an afternoon that was almost aggressively pleasant, warm sun, light breeze, the kind of English summer day that seems to be apologizing for all the rain. Elinor had come with her aunt again, and had been standing near the roses examining a particularly overambitious climbing variety, when a voice beside her said cheerfully, "You look like someone who actually knows about roses, which makes you the most interesting person at this party." Elinor turned. The girl was perhaps 19, dark-haired like her brother, with a quick, bright face and eyes that missed very little. She was smiling in the open, uncomplicated way of someone who either had no guile whatsoever or had so much of it that they had come out the other side. Elinor would later decide it was both, in roughly equal measure. "Cecily Ashford," the girl said, extending her hand. "And before you say anything carefully polite, I already know who you are. My brother's solicitor has been very busy lately." Elinor shook her hand. "Elinor Voss." "I know." Cecily turned back to the roses as if they had been discussing them all along. "They're overpruned, by the way. Lady Pembroke's gardener is enthusiastic but heavy-handed. You can always tell." They walked along the garden beds for a while, talking about nothing consequential, and Elinor found herself, despite every instinct that told her to be careful, genuinely enjoying it. Cecily was funny in a dry, observational way that Elinor recognized as a coping mechanism for someone who had spent a lot of time in rooms where she wasn't supposed to notice things. They understood each other almost immediately. It was Cecily who, as they rounded the far end of the garden path, away from the other guests, said in a tone that was still light but had shifted somehow, "I want you to know what you're walking into." Elinor glanced at her. "My brother is not cruel," Cecily said carefully. "I need you to know that because I also need to tell you things that might make it seem otherwise, and I want you to hold both." She paused. "He is armored. He has been armored for a long time. He says things sometimes that land badly because he has stopped paying attention to how things land. He stopped paying attention because for a while, paying attention was hurting him. She said this with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it, or lived with it long enough that it had become precise on its own. "Harriet Langley," Alina said quietly. Cecily stopped walking. She looked at Alina with something that was equal parts surprise and relief. "You know about her?" "Not much, only the name, and that there was an engagement." Cecily was quiet for a moment. They stood among the roses, the sounds of the party drifting toward them faintly, and Cecily looked at the middle distance and said, "Harriet was lovely, genuinely lovely, not in the way people say to be kind, but actually. She loved him very much. And my mother," she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "My mother has very specific ideas about what the Ashford name requires, and she expressed those ideas consistently, relentlessly, until Harriet couldn't bear it anymore. Until Harriet decided that a man who loved her but didn't stop it wasn't quite loving her enough. She ended the engagement. Married a solicitor from Bath within the year, and by all accounts is perfectly happy. My brother has not processed this exactly. He decided instead that the whole thing was simply the correct outcome. That warmth was a liability. That armor was wisdom." Cecily glanced at her sideways. "Hence the gloves." Alina looked at her. "He told me what he said," Cecily said simply. "At the Whitmore ball, he didn't think I'd find it significant. I found it very significant. A beat." "Why are you telling me this?" Alina asked. Cecily turned to face her fully, and her expression, for the first time, dropped all its lightness and was simply earnest, young and earnest and a little fierce. "Because I have watched my mother break one woman who loved my brother," she said, "and I am not going to watch her break another, especially not," she stopped, "especially not one who I think might be exactly what he needs and is absolutely too sensible to stand for any nonsense." There was a long pause. "You told me deliberately," Alina said. "You weren't being careless." "I'm never careless," Cecily said pleasantly, and then her smile came back bright and quick as before. "Now, shall we go back? I believe they're serving strawberries and I have a deeply held personal policy about strawberries." Alina looked at her for a moment. Then slowly she smiled too. "Lead the way," she said. She thought about it all the way home. About Harriet Langley, about armor, about a man who had made himself cruel at the edges because being soft had cost him something. It didn't excuse the gloves, but it was information, and Alina never wasted information. She looked out the carriage window at the passing countryside and thought about her father's careful face and Cecily's carefully uncalculated candor and the Duke of Ashford's signature on a letter that had tried very hard not to sound like begging. And she made a decision, not about the marriage, not yet, about how she would walk into whatever came next. She would walk in with her eyes open, every single one of her conditions. The meeting was arranged for a Wednesday. A private meeting, her father had called it. Informal. Simply an opportunity for the two parties to become acquainted before any formal announcements were made. He had said this in the careful, neutral tone he used when he wanted something to sound smaller than it was. Alina had nodded and said nothing. She had spent the 2 days before it at her father's desk. Not his desk exactly, her own small writing table by the window in the morning room, the one she had claimed at 14 and never relinquished. She sat there on Monday evening and again on Tuesday morning, with a clean sheet of paper in front of her, and a pen she kept dipping and not using, and she thought. She was not, by nature, an impulsive person. She did not make decisions quickly, and she did not make them emotionally, and she did not make them without first examining them from every angle she could think of, turning them over the way her father turned over a contract, looking for the hidden cost, the buried clause, the place where something that seemed solid was actually held together with goodwill and optimism, and nothing else. She applied this method now to the question of herself. The question being, what did she actually want? Not what her father wanted for her. Not what society expected. Not what made sense on paper or looked correct from the outside or would satisfy the various people who had opinions about Elinor Voss and her future. What did she want, Elinor specifically, who had read too many of her father's letters to be romantic about money, and had watched too many women disappear into marriages to be romantic about titles, but who was also, underneath all the composure and the cataloging and the careful practicality, a person, with a heart that worked, with a capacity for warmth she did not often display because she had learned early that warmth, displayed carelessly, was an invitation for people to take liberties. She thought about Harriet Langley, who had loved openly and been worn down for it. She thought about Cecily, who had decided to trust her with something true. She thought about a man at a ball who had said something unkind and then looked just for a moment, just in the half-second before he looked away faintly, inexplicably unsettled by her response. Not by anger, not by tears, by steadiness, by being looked at and found unremarkable. She picked up the pen. She wrote 3 things on the paper. She read them over once. Then she folded the paper in half and in half again and held it for a moment. Then she went to find her father. He was in the study, as she had known he would be. It was evening and the lamps were lit, and he looked up when she came in with the expression he always wore when he suspected she was about to complicate something he had been hoping would be simple. "Ellie." "I'll agree to it," she said. He blinked. She crossed the room and set the folded paper on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up. She watched his face as he read it, the slight furrow of his brow at the first condition, the longer pause at the second, and then at the third, the moment where his expression did something complicated and almost unreadable, which for Thomas Voss was extraordinary because his face was usually an open book she had long since memorized. He set the paper down. "3 conditions," he said. "3 conditions," she agreed. "The first 2 I can defend. The first is simply dignity, which any decent man should grant without being asked. The second," he tapped the paper, "the second is unusual but not unreasonable. A woman of your means managing her own income is not without precedent." "No," she said, "it isn't." "The third," he stopped, "Elinor, the third one." "I know. This is not how these arrangements work." "I'm aware. You are asking a duke of the realm to make himself vulnerable to you, before the wedding, as a condition." "I'm asking him to be honest with me once," she said calmly, "before I agree to be honest with him for the rest of my life. I think that's a reasonable exchange." Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the paper and folded it again, and placed it very deliberately in the inside pocket of his coat. "I'll present them," he said. "Thank you." "He may refuse." "I know. If he refuses, then we'll know something important about him," Elinor said, "and we'll both be saved a great deal of trouble." She said good night and went to bed and slept, if not easily, then at least with the particular quiet of a person who has done what they could and is prepared for whatever comes next. He almost didn't come. She found out later from Cecily, of course, who found out everything, that the Duke of Ashford had read the conditions, set them down on his library table, walked to the window, stood there for a considerable amount of time, and then said to his solicitor, in a tone that communicated both irritation and reluctant respect, "Fine. Just that. Fine." He arrived on Wednesday at 3 o'clock precisely, which Elinor noted because it was the kind of punctuality that communicated something, not eagerness, but a decision to take the thing seriously. Her father received him briefly in the study, exchanged the necessary pleasantries, and then, in what Elinor suspected was a piece of tactical maneuvering she had not explicitly requested but quietly appreciated, excused himself to see to some correspondence, leaving them alone, in the drawing room. Elinor was already there when the Duke was shown in. She had chosen the chair by the window deliberately, good light, her back to nothing. A small table beside her with tea she had no intention of pouring until she had taken the measure of the first 2 minutes. She stood when he entered because manners cost nothing. He stopped just inside the door. She had seen him across a ballroom. Up close, she took a single composed breath, somewhat more than she had accounted for. The portrait painter's face. The way he occupied a room not by demanding it but by simply being at ease in it, as if every room he entered had been built to his proportions. He was in traveling clothes, understated and well cut, and he looked, she noted this, like a man who had slept badly and was determined not to show it. She recognized that particular determination. She had worn it herself. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He crossed the room and she indicated the chair across from her, and he sat, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The way two people look at each other when they are both doing the same calculation and both know the other one is doing it. "Your conditions," he said without preamble. "Yes. The first two are acceptable. I assumed they would be." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something between them that hadn't settled yet into either. "The third," he said. "Yes. You want me to tell you something true?" "Before the wedding," she said. "Something you haven't told anyone, something real." She paused. "I'm not asking for secrets that would embarrass you or weapons I might use against you. I'm asking for evidence that you're capable of it, that's all." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but then neither is what I'm being asked to agree to." He looked at her steadily, and she looked back at him steadily. And it was, she would think about this later, remarkably equal. Two people sitting across from each other in a drawing room, neither of them flinching, both of them paying attention. It was the most honest thing that had happened to her in a long time. "I'll agree to the third condition," he said at last. "When you're ready," she said. "I'm not putting a date on it, I simply need it to happen before the ceremony." He nodded once. She reached for the teapot. "Now," she said, pouring with the composed efficiency of someone closing one chapter and opening the next, "shall we talk about something else entirely? I find that negotiations go better when they're followed by ordinary conversation. It gives both parties something to think about other than what was just agreed to." He blinked, just slightly. "What would you like to talk about?" he said. "Your estate," she said. "Specifically the eastern farmlands. I've read the reports. I think the drainage problem is being mismanaged, and I'd like to know if you agree." There was a silence. Something crossed his face, so quickly she almost missed it, but she didn't miss it. It was surprise. Genuine, unguarded surprise. The expression of a man who came prepared for one kind of conversation and has found himself in a completely different one. And underneath the surprise, just barely, just for a second, something that looked almost like relief. He set down his cup. "The eastern farmlands," he said slowly. "The drainage reports from last autumn," she said. "Your steward filed 3 of them. The proposed solution is expensive and I think incorrect. The problem isn't the drainage channels themselves, it's the gradient of the western embankment. Fix the embankment and the channels will manage themselves." He stared at her. "How do you know about the drainage reports?" he said. "Your solicitor sent copies to my father as part of the estate overview," she said simply. "I read them." "You read the drainage reports?" "I read everything," she said. "I find it useful." Another silence, longer this time. And then quiet, careful, like a man choosing his footing on uncertain ground. The Duke of Ashford said, "I think you may be right about the embankment." Eleanor picked up her tea. "Tell me what your steward said when you raised it," she said. And just like that, in a drawing room in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, over drainage reports and cooling tea, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony the ballroom had provided, quietly, practically, the way real things tend to begin. The friendship between Eleanor and Cecily Ashford developed the way most genuine friendships do, not in grand moments, but in small ones accumulated quietly over time, like stones placed one by one, until suddenly there is something solid enough to stand on. They walked together 3 times in the fortnight following the Wednesday meeting. Through the park near Cecily's townhouse, along the paths that curved between the elms, at the unhurried pace of 2 people who are ostensibly taking the air, and are actually talking without stopping. They wrote letters on the days they didn't walk, quick, unguarded letters that bore very little resemblance to the careful, formal correspondence Eleanor was used to exchanging with everyone else in her life. Cecily wrote the way she spoke, directly, observationally, with a dry humor that made Eleanor press her lips together to keep from laughing in rooms where laughing would have required explanation. Eleanor wrote back honestly, more honestly than she usually allowed herself with anyone. It surprised her how easy it was. She had been careful for so long. Careful with her thoughts, careful with her words, careful about what she revealed and to whom and in what quantity. It was not coldness. She had never been cold, not really, though she knew some people read her stillness that way. It was simply self-preservation. The habit of a woman who had understood early that intelligence in a drawing room was acceptable only in certain doses and had learned to measure her doses carefully. Cecily required no such measuring. Cecily found Eleanor's intelligence not threatening but delightful, in the way a person delights in finding someone who speaks a language they thought no one else knew. It was on the 3rd walk, a Thursday, with a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and sunlight and had settled on an irritable compromise of both, that Cecily finally told her about Harriet properly. Not the outline, the actual thing. "She came to one of our shooting weekends," Cecily said. "They were walking side by side, their skirts brushing the gravel path. The autumn before the engagement. I was 16, and I thought she was the most wonderful person I had ever met, which I now recognize was partly because I was 16, and partly because she genuinely was wonderful." She paused to redirect around a puddle. She laughed at things, real laughing, not the performed kind. She argued with James, my brother, about poetry, which he pretended to find tiresome and which I could tell he actually loved. She was warm in a way that didn't have any strategy to it. She was simply warm. It was very refreshing in our family. The dry edge of that last sentence landed quietly between them. "Your mother," Eleanor said. "My mother," Cecily confirmed, "is a woman of extraordinary discipline and very specific ideas about what the Ashford name requires from the people who carry it. She was not cruel to Harriet directly. My mother is never directly anything, which is its own kind of skill. But she was consistent and relentless. And she had a gift for finding the thing a person most wanted to be accepted for and making them feel, very subtly, very persistently, that it was the thing that made them most inadequate. Eleanor was quiet. For Harriet it was her family, Cecily said. They were perfectly respectable, old name, modest means, genuine warmth. My mother managed to make Harriet feel that this warmth was a kind of embarrassment, that being loved openly by people without position was something to be apologized for rather than treasured. She stopped walking. Eleanor stopped too. Cecily was looking at the middle distance, at the elm trees, at nothing in particular. "James knew," she said. "That's the part I have never entirely forgiven him for, even though I understand it. He knew what my mother was doing, and he told himself that Harriet was strong enough to manage it. He told himself that love was enough, and that eventually my mother would accept her and that patience would resolve what confrontation would only worsen." She paused. He was wrong. And he knew he was wrong, I think, before the end, but by then Harriet had decided. "That love wasn't enough," Eleanor said. "That she deserved someone who would stand between her and the cold," Cecily said simply. "And she was right. A beat. A cloud passed and the light changed briefly, then changed back. He was devastated, Cecily said. He didn't show it. James doesn't show things, which is its own exhausting habit, but I know what he looks like when something has gone through him. He looked like that for months. She turned to Alina. And then he stopped looking like that, and he started looking like what he looks like now, which is fine and composed and not quite there, in the way of someone who has decided that the solution to being hurt is to be somewhere no one can reach. Alina thought about the drawing room, about the man who had sat across from her and talked about drainage reports and had looked, for one unguarded second, almost relieved. "The sneer," she said, "at the Whitmore ball." "Yes," Cecily's voice was even. "He does that, says something cutting before anyone can get close enough to require something real from him. It keeps people at a comfortable distance." She looked at Alina directly. "It didn't work on you." "No," Alina said. "Why not?" Alina considered this honestly. "Because it didn't surprise me," she said at last. "I had already read his correspondence. I already knew what was underneath. A man who is genuinely cruel doesn't write letters that worried about what his tenants would think if the estate failed." She paused. "He wrote about his tenants twice, in a letter about money." Cecily looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "He doesn't know you know about those letters, does he?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Alina thought about the drawing room again, about the drainage reports, about the almost relief. "Eventually," she said, "when it's the right moment." Cecily nodded slowly. She seemed to be turning something over in her mind, examining it. "He's been asking about you," she said finally. "Since the Wednesday meeting. He doesn't ask directly, he never asks directly, but he mentions things, finds reasons to bring your name up in conversation. Yesterday he said, entirely unprompted, that he thought your point about the embankment gradient was probably correct and that he had spoken to his steward about it." Alina said nothing. "For James," Cecily said, "that is approximately equivalent to writing you a sonnet." Despite herself, despite every instinct toward composure, Alina felt something shift very slightly in her chest. Small and warm and not entirely welcome in its timing. She looked at the elm trees. "He should fix the embankment," she said. "He's going to fix the embankment," Cecily said. They resumed walking. Alina thought about what Cecily had told her on the way home, and that evening, and in the quiet of the following morning when she sat at her writing table before the rest of the house was awake. She thought about armor. She understood armor. She had her own version of it, not the cutting remark, not the sneer, but the stillness. The composure that people mistook for coldness. The careful measuring of doses. The way she had learned to be present in a room while keeping the most important parts of herself entirely elsewhere, somewhere safe, somewhere no one could find without an invitation she had not yet decided to issue. She had built that too over years, out of something. Out of moments. She understood more than she cared to admit the logic of it. What she didn't know, what she was still turning over, still examining from every angle, was whether the Duke of Ashford was a man who had built armor because something had wounded him and would take it off when the wound healed. Or whether he had worn it so long it had become the shape of him. There was a difference, a significant one. She thought about his face when she had mentioned the drainage reports, the surprise, the relief underneath it, the way he had leaned forward just slightly like a man who has been in a conversation he didn't expect and finds he doesn't want it to stop. She thought about the letter, his tenants, twice. She picked up her pen. She didn't write anything. She just held it, turning it in her fingers, thinking. Then she wrote a letter to Cecily suggesting they walk on Saturday. And then, on a fresh piece of paper, she began drafting notes about the eastern farmlands. Not because anyone had asked her to. Not because it was her responsibility. Because the problem was interesting, and she was good at problems. And she allowed herself this much honesty, alone in the early morning quiet, because somewhere between the drainage channels and the embankment gradient, she had started to care whether the estate survived. She was not yet ready to examine why. She folded the farmland notes neatly, labeled them in her careful hand, and set them aside. Outside, the sun was coming up. Somewhere across the city, she suspected, the Duke of Ashford was also awake, possibly standing at a window, possibly thinking about drainage reports. Possibly she allowed herself to thinking about something else entirely. She was not going to think about that. She made tea. The dinner was Lady Harcastle's idea. Which was, Eleanor would later reflect, the first warning sign. Lady Harcastle was the Duke's mother's oldest friend, a woman of tremendous social precision who hosted events the way, a general plans campaigns, with careful attention to positioning, timing, and the strategic placement of people who might usefully observe one another under pressure. The guest list was 18, intimate enough to feel personal, large enough that no individual conversation could be entirely private. Long table, fixed seating, no possibility of retreat. Eleanor understood when the invitation arrived exactly what it was: a test. Not of her feelings, not of her suitability in any genuine sense. Those questions had already been settled in rooms she hadn't been present for. This was a test of a different and older kind. The kind women of a certain position had been administering to other women for generations. Could she be made to flinch? She dressed that evening with particular care. Not because she was nervous. She was not nervous, or at least she had packed the nervousness away in a place where it wouldn't interfere with anything, but because she understood that clothing, in rooms like the one she was walking into, was a language, and she intended to be perfectly fluent. The gown was deep blue silk, simply cut, worth a quiet fortune. Her jewelry was her grandmother's, not ostentatious but old, and to anyone who knew what they were looking at, unmistakably fine. And the gloves. She had not planned to wear them. She had stood in front of her wardrobe for a long moment, turning the question over, and then she had reached for them with the calm of a person who has decided that the honest choice is usually the correct one. The ivory lace gloves from the Whitmore ball. She arrived at exactly the right time, neither early nor fashionably late, but precisely when someone confident of their welcome would arrive. She was received by Lady Harcastle with a warmth that was warm in the same way that decorative ironwork is warm, beautiful, elaborate, and fundamentally cold to the touch. The Duke was already there. He saw her come in. She knew he did, though she didn't look at him immediately. She had learned over the past weeks that the Duke of Ashford had a way of occupying the edge of her awareness even when she wasn't attending to him directly, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing that you are somehow conscious of regardless. She looked at him when she was ready. His expression when his gaze dropped very briefly, very quickly to her gloves was unreadable, but he held it there for just a half-second longer than strictly necessary. She inclined her head slightly. He inclined his in return. They were placed at the same end of the table but not adjacent, 4 seats apart, with his mother between them in terms of proximity if not in terms of seating. Close enough that conversation could cross the table naturally, deliberately arranged. The first 2 courses passed without incident. The conversation was what it always was in rooms like this, glancing, circling, full of references designed to establish position and test knowledge, and remind everyone present of who belonged and who was merely visiting. Eleanor navigated it the way she navigated everything, attentively, economically, without volunteering more than was useful. She noticed the Duchess watching her. Not obviously. The Duchess of Ashford was far too skilled for obviousness, but she was watching, cataloging, assessing, the way Eleanor herself cataloged and assessed, except that Eleanor did it to understand and the Duchess, she suspected, did it to identify weakness. It happened during the 3rd course. The conversation had turned naturally, as these things never naturally turn, meaning someone had steered it there deliberately, to the question of family and lineage. Someone mentioned an old name. Someone else mentioned another. The genealogical map of English society was being unrolled across the table the way it always was in these moments, each name a marker of belonging, each reference a small, elegant reminder of who had roots here and how deep those roots went. The Duchess set down her wine glass. "It is such a particular pleasure," she said, in a voice that carried the length of the table without appearing to try, "to see old families maintaining their connections. There is something so important about understanding where one comes from, don't you think?" General agreement rippled around the table. "Of course," the Duchess continued, "not everyone has the benefit of that kind of history." A small pause precisely waited. "Some connections are newer, which has its own charm, I suppose, a certain freshness." She did not look at Alina. She didn't need to, the table understood. Alina felt it, the slight shift in the room's atmosphere, the way several pairs of eyes moved toward her and away again, with the practiced discretion of people watching an accident happen from a safe distance. She felt the Duchess's words settle over the table like a fine dusting of something cold. She picked up her fork. She set it down again. Not quickly, not in agitation. She set it down the way a person sets something down when they have made a decision and require both hands free, metaphorically speaking. The table had gone fractionally quieter. Alina looked up. "You're right, Your Grace," she said pleasantly. "History is important, though I've always found it interesting how selectively we choose to remember it." The Duchess turned to look at her. Her expression was serene. The serenity of someone who has administered this particular kind of cold and is accustomed to watching it work. "Oh," she said. Alina's voice was unhurried, conversational. "The families we celebrate for their longevity, we often forget to mention which decades were difficult, which winters were hard, which friends quietly extended a hand when the history being made was not the kind anyone wanted written down." She paused. "Old families have old debts, too. The good ones remember them, the great ones remember them with gratitude." A silence. Not a long one, perhaps 4 seconds, but in a room that calibrated itself to social temperature the way this room did, 4 seconds was considerable. Alina picked up her fork. She continued eating. The table, after a moment, resumed its conversation. The Duchess said nothing further. She returned to her wine with the composed expression of a woman who had engaged a mechanism she was used to controlling and found it, on this occasion, had not performed as expected. Across the table, Alina did not look at the Duke. She didn't need to. She could feel his stillness from 4 seats away. She found the terrace afterward by instinct more than intention, simply following the evening air, the need for a moment outside the careful warmth of rooms that asked too much of you. The French doors were open at the far end of the corridor, and she stepped through them and stood in the quiet dark, the sounds of the dinner party muffled behind the glass, the garden below lit palely by a 3/4 moon. She had been there perhaps 2 minutes when she heard the door behind her. She didn't turn. "Miss Voss." His voice was low. She had noticed over the past weeks that he had 2 registers, the social one, effortless and carrying, designed for rooms, and this one, quieter, more careful, the voice he used when he was not performing anything. "Your Grace," she said. He came to stand beside her at the balustrade, not close, a proper distance, but close enough that she was aware of him with that same below-threshold frequency she had noticed at the dinner table. He was quiet for a moment. She let him be. "Where did you get the gloves?" he said. She had been wondering when he would ask. She turned to look at him. His profile in the moonlight was the portrait painter's face again, all clean angles and carved shadows. He was looking out at the garden with the expression of a man who is asking about one thing and meaning another. "They were your mother's," she said. He turned then, sharply, not with anger, with the particular alertness of someone who has just heard something they did not expect. She told him. quietly, simply, without drama. Her grandmother, a woman of no title but considerable character, had been acquainted with the Ashford household during a year when the previous duke had been ill and the finances had contracted sharply. Not a crisis, not publicly, but a difficult season. Her grandmother had helped. Not with loans, not formally, but with the kind of practical, generous, unremarked assistance that women of good character have always provided each other across the fences of class, when the men were too proud to ask, and the women simply got on with it. At the end of it, the Duchess, the current Duke's grandmother, had sent a gift, a pair of gloves, Parisian lace, extraordinarily fine. Her grandmother had kept them, never worn them, they were too fine for her ordinary life, and she was a practical woman who distrusted objects that were too fine for ordinary life. But she had kept them carefully, wrapped in tissue, in a box that had eventually passed to Aline's mother, and then to Aline. "I knew what they were when I wore them to the Whitmore ball," Aline said. "I recognized the provenance. I had seen the original note that came with them." She paused. "I didn't wear them to make a point. I wore them because they were beautiful and because they had been given in a spirit of generosity, and I thought that was worth honoring." He stared at her. In the moonlight, his face had done something she had not seen it do before. The armor, that careful, cultivated, endlessly maintained armor, had developed a crack. Not a collapse, just a crack. Something underneath it showing through, raw and startled and genuine. "You knew," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I knew." "At the Whitmore ball, when he stopped." "Yes," she said simply, "when you said what you said." He turned away, looked out at the garden again, and she watched him stand there, this complicated, armored, exhausted man, and she watched him understand, fully, completely, without any remaining possibility of not understanding, what he had aimed at and what he had missed. The silence lasted long enough that the garden sounds came through it, crickets somewhere, the faint drift of music from inside. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You do," she agreed. Another silence. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the social apology, the performed, reflexive, frictionless kind she had heard from people who apologized the way they breathed, without particular meaning. This was the other kind, slower, weighted, the kind that cost something. She received it. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet again. Then he said, without looking at her, "She'll do it again, my mother. She'll find other moments." "I know," Aline said. "I should have," he stopped. "Harriet." "You don't have to say it," Aline said. "I want to." He turned to look at her. His expression was open, she thought, more open than she had seen it, more open perhaps than he had allowed it to be in a long time. "I let it happen before. I told myself it would resolve itself. I was wrong and I knew I was wrong and I didn't act on it, and I have spent 3 years deciding that the lesson was to stop feeling things that could be taken away." He paused. That was the wrong lesson. Aline looked at him for a long moment. "What is the right lesson?" she asked. He met her eyes. "That the feeling isn't the problem," he said. "The silence is." She held his gaze. Something shifted between them again, not quietly this time, not practically, not the way it had shifted in the drawing room over drainage reports and cooling tea. This was different, warmer, more consequential. She looked away first. Not in retreat, she never retreated, but because she needed a moment in which she was not looking directly at it. "I'm going back inside," she said. "Yes," he said. "Your Grace." "James," he said. If you would," she considered this. "Aline," she said. He nodded once. She went back inside. She rejoined the dinner party and finished the evening with complete and unruffled composure, laughed at 2 things that were genuinely funny and smiled at several things that were not, and said goodbye to Lady Harcastle with a warmth that was not decorative ironwork at all. In the carriage home, her hands folded in her lap, the ivory gloves catching the lamplight from the street, she permitted herself alone in the dark, with no one watching, to close her eyes and breathe. She did not know that behind her, still on the terrace, the Duke of Ashford, James, stood for another 10 minutes in the garden dark, looking at nothing, thinking about a woman who had worn his grandmother's gloves to a ball and looked at him like he was simply a man who had said something unkind, and who had looked at him tonight like he might be something more than that. He went inside. He found his mother in the drawing room. He spoke to her quietly, very quietly. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. The Duchess's expression did not change, it never changed, but something in it contracted slightly, the way something contracts when it has encountered unexpected resistance. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her conversation. He accepted a glass of port from a passing tray and rejoined the other guests, and did not look toward the door Eleanor had left through. But he thought about it. The whole evening, he thought about it. The wedding was set for the 14th of October, 6 weeks away. Eleanor knew this the way she knew most things about the arrangement, not from James directly, not yet, but from the steady accumulation of practical information that surrounded a formal engagement like weather surrounding a house. The modiste, the announcements, the careful, choreographed series of appearances that signaled to society that the thing was real and settled and proceeding according to plan. It was proceeding according to plan. Eleanor was not entirely certain how she felt about that. She sat at her writing table in the early mornings, her thinking time, the quiet hour before the house came alive, and she examined herself honestly, the way she always did, with the same dispassionate precision she applied to drainage reports and financial correspondence. She took stock. She was not unhappy. That much was clear. The meetings with James had continued, twice a week now, sometimes in her father's drawing room, and sometimes in the small, book-lined sitting room at the Ashford townhouse that he had apparently designated as the room in which actual conversations happened, as distinct from the formal rooms in which performances happened. She had noticed the distinction immediately. She had found it, privately, endearing in a way she hadn't expected. They talked about the estate, about the farmlands, where the embankment work had begun and was proceeding. She had been right about the gradient, which he had acknowledged with the particular brevity of someone who found acknowledgement uncomfortable, but was choosing to practice it regardless. About the tenants, about the financial restructuring her father's people were managing, which she had asked to be briefed on directly, and which James had agreed to without the hesitation she had half expected. They talked about books, about his sister, who he spoke of with a dry, helpless affection that told her everything she needed to know about who he actually was underneath the armor. About her father, whom James had begun to regard with a cautious, complicated respect that Thomas Voss returned with something approaching genuine liking, which Eleanor suspected had surprised them both. They talked increasingly about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of everything. He made her laugh twice. She had not told him that. She had simply laughed, both times at something so precisely observed that she hadn't been able to prevent it, and he had looked at her afterward with an expression she was still turning over. Like a man who has unexpectedly discovered a room in a house he thought he knew completely. She acknowledged to herself in the early morning quiet, in a significant amount of trouble. Not the dangerous kind, the other kind. The kind that arrives quietly and makes the ordinary arrangements of your life feel suddenly, stubbornly inadequate. She picked up her pen. She set it down. 6 weeks. He still hadn't fulfilled the third condition. She didn't press him on it. She had meant what she said. She wasn't putting a date on it, wasn't going to manufacture the moment or demand the intimacy on a schedule. That would have defeated the purpose entirely. The point was not the information. The point was the willingness, the capacity, the proof that underneath the armor there was still a person who knew how to hand something fragile to someone else and trust them with it. She waited. She noticed over those weeks that he was circling it, the way a person circles a difficult thing they have decided to do and are simply finding the right approach to. He would begin conversations and then redirect them. He would look at her sometimes with an expression that had almost something in it, a particular quality of attention that felt like standing at the edge of something and not yet stepping. She understood it completely. She did the same thing herself in the mornings, sitting with her pen and her honest accounting of her own feelings. She would get to the edge of something true and find reasons to redirect. They were, she thought, remarkably well matched in their particular varieties of difficulty. It was a Tuesday when it happened. 3 weeks before the wedding. An ordinary afternoon, she had come to the townhouse to review the final estate documents with James and his solicitor, a dry and efficient man named Partridge who had been managing the Ashford finances for 15 years, and regarded the entire restructuring arrangement with the barely concealed relief of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Partridge finished his presentation, gathered his papers, and excused himself with the practiced discretion of someone who had learned when to leave rooms. The door clicked shut. Eleanor was making a note in the margin of the document in front of her. James was at the window. He went to windows the way her father went to stillness, which was to say, when he needed to think. She had learned to recognize it. She didn't interrupt it. She finished her note. The room was quiet. "I've been trying to work out how to do this for 3 weeks," James said. She looked up. He was still at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him, looking out at whatever the Ashford townhouse windows looked out at. She had never checked. She made a note to check. "The third condition," she said. "Yes." She set down her pen. She waited. He was quiet long enough that she began to construct, in the careful architecture of her mind, a kind of shelter for the possibility that he wasn't going to be able to do it. That 3 weeks of circling had brought him to the edge, and the edge was still too far. That this was the thing that would tell her what she needed to know, and what it would tell her was the harder version. She built the shelter carefully, just in case. Then he turned. He looked at her across the room, this man, this complicated, armored, genuinely trying man, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not broken open, not collapsed, just present. Simply and entirely present in the way people rarely are when they know they are being looked at. "I had decided to let it go," he said. She waited. "The estate, 2 years ago, perhaps a little more. I had looked at everything, the debts, the projections, the years of managing and rearranging, and I had made a private decision that it was finished. That I would wind it down responsibly, see the tenants settled as well as I could manage, and let the rest of it go." He paused. "The title, the house, my mother's expectations, all of it." Eleanor was very still. "I had made my peace with it," he said, "or I thought I had. There was, I won't pretend there wasn't relief in it. The decision, I mean. After years of carrying something that was only getting heavier, the decision to put it down felt almost like freedom." He stopped, looked at the window, looked back at her. "And then I went to the Whitmore ball. The room was very quiet. I don't know why I said what I said," he said. "About the gloves. I have thought about it many times since, and I don't have a satisfying explanation. I saw someone who was completely at ease in herself in a room full of people performing ease, and something in me wanted to disturb that. The way a person wants to disturb a still surface, for no better reason than that." He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "That is not a justification," he said. "I know what it was. It was the action of someone who had decided, very privately, that the world owed him damage in return for the damage it had done him, and had found a target." He looked at her directly. "You were not a fair target. You were simply standing there." Eleanor did not speak. "And you looked at me," he said. "The way you looked at me. And I went home that night and I thought, not about what I had said, not yet, but about that look, about what it had done to me. Which was to make me feel, for the first time in perhaps 2 years, like a man who was capable of doing better." He paused. "Not that I had done better, that I was capable of it. There's a difference." "There is," she said quietly. "Your father's letter arrived 6 weeks later," he said, And I told myself it was coincidence, that the timing meant nothing. But when Partridge laid out the arrangement and I understood who your father was and, by extension, who you were, I thought—" He stopped again. She waited. "I thought that the look was the beginning of something," he said, "not the end of something, and I decided that I wanted to find out if I was right." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The afternoon light lay across the floor between them, pale gold and perfectly still. Alina looked at this man who had spent 3 weeks working up to handing her something fragile, and she allowed herself to feel fully without managing or measuring it. The thing she had been redirecting herself away from every morning at her writing table. It was considerable. She picked up her pen. She set it down again. "Your turn," he said quietly. You don't have to. It wasn't in the conditions that you would." "I know," she said. "I want to." He waited. She looked at her hands, at the edge of the document in front of her, at the room she had come to know over the past weeks, the books she had noticed and catalogued, the window she had always meant to look out of. "I was afraid," she said, "when I wrote the 3 conditions." "Of what?" "That you would meet all of them," she said. "I had written them as I told myself they were a test, a reasonable practical evaluation of whether this was a man I could respect, could work with, could build something functional with." She paused. "But I knew, writing them, I knew the real reason. The real reason was that if you met them, if you were genuinely capable of the things I was asking for, then I would have no reason left to protect myself from you." The room was absolutely still. "And I have been very carefully protected," she said, "for a very long time." He crossed the room. Not quickly, not dramatically. He crossed the room the way everything real had happened between them, at a measured, unhurried pace, as if speed would break something that was only just becoming solid enough to hold weight. He stopped in front of her chair. She looked up at him. "I met all 3 of them," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you afraid now?" She considered this honestly. "Yes," she said, "but differently." He reached out carefully, asking, and she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Outside somewhere a carriage passed. The clock ticked. The afternoon light shifted a degree. Neither of them moved. "I would like," he said very quietly, "to stop deciding that the world owes me damage." "I would like," she said equally quietly, "to stop measuring my doses. A beat." "That seems like a reasonable basis," he said. "It does," she said. She stood. They were very close now. The portrait painter's face and the exhaustion gone from it, replaced by something else, something careful and new and deeply, visibly real. He raised her hand. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, over the gloves, over the Parisian lace, over everything those gloves had carried between his family and hers across the years, and held them there for a moment. She felt it through the fabric, all of it. They were married on the 14th of October. It was not a large wedding. Alina had not wanted large, and James had agreed with a relief that made Cecily, standing beside Alina as her attendant, press her lips together to hide a smile. Small. Family. The people who had actually been present for the story rather than merely adjacent to it. Thomas Voss cried. He was extremely dignified about it. He produced a handkerchief at exactly the right moment and was fully composed again within 30 seconds, and he would have denied it entirely to anyone who asked. But Alina had been watching his face for 26 years, and she knew what she saw. She was glad. She was, as she stood at the altar and looked at the man across from her, this difficult, complicated, genuinely trying man who had sneered at her gloves and ended up grateful for them. Glad in a way that was not simple or tidy, or the kind of gladness she had always privately suspected she would feel if she ever got here. It was better than that. It was solid. It was honest. It had been built out of drainage reports and difficult conversations and 3 conditions on a folded piece of paper and a terrace in the dark and a Tuesday afternoon when someone had finally, carefully, handed something fragile across the distance between them. She said her vows clearly, without trembling. He said his and looked at her the entire time. The morning room at Ashford Park had become Eleanor's. Not by declaration. No one had announced it. No formal transfer of territory had occurred. It had simply happened, the way things happen when a house begins to understand its inhabitants. The room faced east, which meant good light from early morning through midday. It had 3 windows and a fireplace that drew well and bookshelves that had been half empty when Eleanor arrived and were now entirely full. Her writing table stood at the center window, positioned at a slight angle that she had adjusted twice before finding exactly right. She was at it now. Outside, October had arrived in the particular way it arrived at Ashford Park, slowly, generously, laying color across the grounds with an unhurried hand. The elms along the eastern drive had gone deep gold. The kitchen garden was finished for the year, stripped back and resting. The embankment project had been completed in August. The new drainage channels were performing exactly as she had predicted, and the eastern farmlands had produced their first genuinely healthy harvest in 6 years. She had received a note from the head tenant, Mr. Birch, thanking her personally. She had kept it. It was folded in the small drawer at the left side of her writing table, along with 3 letters from Cecily, who was in Bath for the autumn with a friend, and writing frequently and well, and her grandmother's original note about the gloves. She had found the note while going through a box of her grandmother's things in the spring. A single card, in handwriting gone faint with age. For your kindness this winter. Some gifts are only beautiful if they are worn. She had held it for a long time. Then she had placed it carefully in the drawer. She was working now on the correspondence for the northern tenants, a matter of some complexity involving a boundary dispute that had been festering since before James had inherited the estate and which she had decided, with characteristic practicality, to simply resolve. She had the relevant documents spread before her, annotated in 3 colors of ink, and she was in the middle of a sentence when the door opened. She did not look up. She had learned over the course of a year to identify James by the sound of how he opened doors. He opened them with a particular quality of attention, not loudly, not carelessly, but with the kind of deliberateness that characterized everything he did when he had decided to be present somewhere. She heard him cross the room. She finished her sentence. He set something on the table beside her right hand. She looked at it. A small box, dark green leather, the color of the Ashford estate livery, slightly worn at the corners in a way that suggested it was not new. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up at him. He was standing beside the table with his hands in his pockets, and an expression she had catalogued over the past year, as the one he wore when he had done something he wasn't entirely certain about and was waiting to find out if it had been right. She had become fond of that expression. She looked back at the box. She opened it. Inside, folded with extraordinary care on a bed of ivory tissue, a pair of gloves, Parisian lace, ivory white, identical in every particular, the weight of the fabric, the precision of the pattern, the fine quality that announced itself quietly to anyone who knew what they were looking at, to the gloves she had worn to the Whitmore ball. She did not speak immediately. She lifted one glove from the tissue, turned it over in her hands, felt the lace between her fingers, light and intricate and impossibly well made, the work of someone who had understood that the finest things are built one careful detail at a time. "Where did you get these?" she said. "The same atelier," he said. "In Paris, I wrote to them in the spring." She looked up at him. "You wrote to them in the spring," she said. It took some time to locate the original pattern, a pause. They still had it. She looked at the gloves again. There was something happening in her chest that she had stopped trying to manage or measure approximately 8 months ago, when she had decided, in the early morning quiet of her writing table, with characteristic practicality and complete honesty, that some things were simply not improved by management. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said simply, "In case you ever need to remind me." She looked up at him. "Of what?" she said, though she knew. "Of what I am capable of," he said, "when I am not being an idiot." She looked at him for a long moment. This man, a year on, a year deeper into the complicated, honest daily work of knowing someone, this man who had sneered at her gloves and spoken to his mother on a terrace, and crossed a room on a Tuesday afternoon, and said his vows and looked at her the entire time, who fixed embankments and remembered tenant names and opened doors with attention, and had spent the spring writing to a Paris atelier about a lace pattern. "James," she said. "Alina," he said, and then she laughed. Not the composed near smile she had deployed in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, and in all the careful, managed spaces of the life before. Not the polite, measured expression that people had sometimes mistaken for warmth and sometimes mistaken for coldness, and which had been, in truth, neither, simply the face of a woman who had learned to keep the real thing somewhere safe. This was the real thing. Full and unguarded and entirely genuine, the kind of laugh that arrives when something is both funny and true at the same time, when the relief and the joy of a thing land together, and there is simply no composure left to deploy against them. It filled the morning room. It went out through the 3 east-facing windows and into the October garden and up through the golden elms along the drive, and James Ashford, Duke of Ashford, stood beside his wife's writing table and watched her laugh and felt something settle in him, deep and permanent, in the place where the exhaustion used to live like the last stone placed in a very long piece of work. He had sneered at her gloves once. He had spent every day since quietly, steadily, deliberately becoming a man who deserved the person wearing them. He thought he was getting there. He was almost certain she agreed. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and share your thoughts about the story. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.